In this presentation, I will be providing some expanded information that you will need beyond the Chapter 12 overview and the Chapter 12 text itself. So let's dive in. This is all, of course, going to be about the presidency. And what we're going to be considering here is presidential power over time. And from the outset, it's important to understand that presidents have always claimed that they have certain key powers. Some of this is implied. There is something that's referred to as the ordinance power. It's implied in the sense that the Constitution, in its description of the president's executive functions to enforce congressional legislation and operate the executive branch, implies that the president has some power to issue orders. And of course, when we talk about ordinances, usually we're thinking about that in the context of city ordinances, which are municipal laws. In this sense, it's kind of the same thing, that the president can issue some things that should have the force of law within the executive branch. And of course, we've seen that, and we know that executive orders are presidential directives that have the force of law within the executive branch, at least, to manage different parts within the executive branch. Think here the bureaucracy in particular. Other powers have been claimed early but have been contested. And here, front and center, we have executive privilege, which is the idea that the executive branch, in order to secure the integrity of its operation, does not have to provide information to Congress when it chooses to withhold that information, because the executive deems that that information is not required to be shared with Congress and is important for ensuring the president's autonomy as an independent and co-equal branch. And of course, as we see in that example, this is not new. This was something that was claimed by the first president of the United States, George Washington. And kind of to fast forward a bit to what we're seeing today, and not just in the current administration, but looking at the George W. Bush administration, Barack Obama's administration, and now, really Donald Trump first administration, Biden administration, and as we enter the second Trump administration, presidential power appears to be on the ascendant, meaning that it is climbing and increasing, and maybe eclipsing the power of the other branches of government. This was not always the case. The early presidents of the United States mostly followed something that has come to be known as the Whig theory of presidential power. And Whig theory is pretty simple. Congress is the lead branch for policy making, and they have the legislative power. New policies will issue from Congress, and the president's job is to enforce policies created by Congress, essentially. So the president's supposed to stay in their lane and exercise only those powers that the Congress expressly gives to the executive. And remember, express powers are something we talk about as a concept. Expressed power means that it is explicitly stated as a power given to a branch of government. And that's why when we look at Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution, pay attention to that long list of express powers given to Congress. And presidents also have expressed powers, but they're not as extensive, especially in listing, as what we see for the Congress. There were exceptions even during this earlier period of American history. Andrew Jackson, I'll put here with a question mark. He was, of course, in this old political cartoon, depicted as seeking to be like a monarch, King Andrew I. But if we note, the reason that he is being seen as King Andrew I is simply that he exercised his veto power significantly and extensively. But of course, the veto power is one of the express powers of the executive. And so he was interpreted as overusing that power, but it is an express power. So definitely a question mark with whether Andrew Jackson really was that much of an exception to Whig theory. He certainly had big ambitions and clashed with other parts of the government. But in terms of his actions, really, in the end, pretty limited. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, we see a more clear example of a president who takes a more expansive view of their power, especially in the example used here, executive order. The Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves being held in Confederate states. It only applies in Confederate states, parts of the country that were in rebellion against the Union. And he claimed that by executive order he could free those people from slavery. And of course, I mean, that was millions of people affected by that. And so, I mean, kind of departs from that Whig theory. There's not something that would suggest that an executive order, which again we usually, especially as you've seen in your text, is kind of stated as a fairly narrow power to manage the executive branch, and Abraham Lincoln used it clearly in a way that affected millions of people who were outside of the executive branch and outside of the government. As we get to the progressive era, presidential power grows. And remember, progressive is a loaded term in American politics. And, in some sense, I mean, its normative use kind of puts a privilege to anything that is labeled as progressive, because obviously anything that would not be progressive would be essentially regressive. So we can be careful how we use the word progressive. And remember, a lot of these progressive leaders, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, they had certainly quite a few ideas we would not consider progressive, such as eugenics. And then there's Woodrow Wilson's own academic writing discussing the hierarchy of races, at which he put Northern Europeans at the top of a worldwide racial hierarchy. So be careful as we think about this era. But back to the subject at hand, presidential power. Here we see what has been termed stewardship theory, which doesn't necessarily sound like it would be a rapid departure or a drastic departure in presidential power, but this flips the script we see from Whig theory. Essentially what stewardship theory says is that presidents should be able to do anything except those things that are expressly prohibited in the Constitution. So, I mean, it really is the opposite of the Whig theory of presidential power. We can certainly see stewardship theory exercised by both of the presidents Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, famously exercising power to bust trusts, FDR trying to drag the rest of the federal government, drag Congress along in support of his New Deal legislation. And of course, I mean, with Franklin Roosevelt, there's also the internment of Italians and Germans, but especially Japanese residents and citizens of America during World War II. Those broad uses of power. By the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is writing of the imperial presidency, which you can see in the cover from this book, The Escalation of Presidential Power, and considers what Congress and the people can do about it. And understand, I mean, Arthur Schlesinger, among historians, he is sometimes referred to, certainly by one of my professors in undergrad, referred to him as kind of the historian for the Democrat Party. And yet he is talking about presidential power in general as something that Congress and the people should do something about. All right. And it really, so in thinking about the imperial presidency in the 50s, we have Eisenhower, um, we have Truman for also the early 1950s, and then we have John F. Kennedy, and what we're going to be getting to is kind of what are really seen as the height of the imperial presidency, um, Nixon, well, Lyndon Johnson, and then Nixon. Let's see, get back to that. What we see, though, after the 1960s is, for a while, a decline in presidential power. And this picks up in the 1970s. Lyndon Johnson's use of executive power, especially in terms of prosecuting the Vietnam War, which, although we call it the Vietnam War, was never a war declared by Congress. And a lot of what brought the United States into it was kind of an escalation of the use of U.S. military force that was driven by executive action. And I mean, of course, this goes along with how people perceived Lyndon Johnson and how he was known in his interactions with others. You can find many of these types of images of Lyndon Johnson's interactions with members of Congress, for example. I mean, he often was kind of an overbearing and intentionally tried to use, his height and his personal presence to intimidate people. Nixon, also, his actions in the early 1970s were seen as problematic. Most notably, the one that everyone will remember is the Watergate scandal. So between the actions of these two presidents, in the eyes of a lot of people, presidential power was discredited. And, even especially with the case of Nixon and the Watergate scandal, the office itself was discredited. And as a result, there are pretty important efforts to rein in president's power. One of those is the War Powers Act of 1973. And the War Powers Act of 1973, it is a response to both the Korean, but especially the Vietnam War. And kind of what's most essential for us in the War Powers Act of 1973, presidents must notify Congress within 48 hours of military action initiated by the president, and that action, at least in terms of how the law is written and how it's supposed to function on paper, prohibits that continued use of armed force for more than 60 days without congressional approval. Now, in practice, I know this is kind of getting outside of this narrative of the declining presidential power, but do understand that presidents have often kind of fiddled with what is a consistent military action. When did one start? When did another begin? When did the first one stop? I know that sounds like just a lot of sleight of hand, and it kind of is, but presidents have been able to manipulate that to kind of essentially kick that 60-day closing of the window for use of force down the road, and allowing it to carry on past the limits Congress intended. And now back to the act itself and presidential reaction to it. This was an act passed by Congress in 1973. Nixon vetoed it, and Congress overrode that veto, which, remember, requires 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. Regarding the War Powers Act of 1973, this is a reaction to the wars in Korea and Vietnam, but especially the Vietnam War, which sees U.S. involvement at different scales and increasing scale for much of this time period between 1954 and the withdrawal of troops, and that withdrawal occurs in 1973. The War Powers Act was resisted by President Nixon. He, in fact, vetoed the War Powers Act. Congress, however, overrode that veto, and remember, that takes the votes of 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. And the War Powers Act, it is very much designed to stop the kind of gradual escalation and further involvement that would bring the United States into a protracted conflict like the Vietnam War. Presidents are supposed to inform Congress within 48 hours of initiating military action, and that military action, according to the law, is supposed to stop at the end of 60 days unless Congress has approved continued military action. Now, just as an aside, and I don't want to take too much away from the narrative of declining presidential power, in practice, presidents can do a lot of things to really get around the War Powers Act. And lots of times they have complied with that. There have been well over 100 instances in which presidents have informed Congress of military action under the War Powers Act. Once they've done that, however, there are things they can do to kind of fiddle with the timing and maybe say, well, the initial military action stopped, but now what I'm doing is different. And by doing that, they can kick that 60-day can down the road and continue military action past what in the law or the spirit of the law would suggest is that 60-day window. Another case, and we kind of talked about the consequences of this before, but I haven't named the case for you, so we'll do that now. This is Train versus City of New York, a 1975 case. The case centers on actions by the Nixon administration. Of course, it's not decided until after Nixon is out of office. But what this case determined was that presidents had limited power, limited leeway or autonomy to decide how to use funds that Congress had appropriated for specific purposes. What the Nixon administration was doing is, in some cases, they thought, these are things Congress budgeted for, they've appropriated for, but we as the Nixon administration think this is too much money and we don't want to spend it on those activities. And so they just wouldn't. They would not spend the appropriated money. And as we kind of talked about before, presidents do have some discretion in the spending of money within the bureaucracy. However, what the Supreme Court case said is that presidents cannot simply refuse to use appropriated funds the way Congress intended. But try and keep the case as simple as that. And so if Congress appropriates money for something, the president and the executive branch, as the branch tasked with enforcing the law, must enforce that budgetary law and spend the money as Congress instructed that money to be spent. And as a result of these efforts and some other factors, we have weak presidents, essentially between 1974 and 2001. And the two most obvious cases of that, unfortunately for both gentlemen, it's quite possible that they get more of a bad rap than they deserve. I mean, they were the recipients of these efforts of Congress to rein in the presidency. They also had their own personal situations that weakened them as presidents. Gerald Ford is the only president of the United States who was not only never elected as president, he wasn't even elected as vice president. He was appointed by Nixon after Spiro Agnew had to resign, something we've talked about. That was done under the 25th Amendment. And then when Richard Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president. That did not put him in a strong position. And of course, I mean, things like this video of him falling down the stairs getting off of Air Force One, none of that helped. I know that seems like petty things to weaken a president, but appearance is quite important. Carter, same story. He's famously known for his malaise speech during the 70s, talking about like the energy crisis, the limitations on supplies of energy, high prices. The image from this, he was wearing a cardigan sweater, which he was kind of famous for, and you guys know, having seen me, I am myself a fan of the cardigan sweater, but he wore it in a video, right, kind of chiding Americans to turn down their thermostats and conserve energy. Right? And if you're cold, put on a sweater. And this is not something that Americans in general have historically liked to hear. I mean, they want to have energy, they want it to be abundant, and they want it to be cheap. And they do not want a president of the United States, right, giving this kind of signal of weakness that we can't just do whatever we want. And so that also kind of hurt Carter. And he also had a background as a peanut farmer, which was sometimes used to his advantage and sometimes used to kind of portray him as weak and not presidential caliber by his opponents. Even when we think about Reagan and Clinton, however, and I will kind of leave George H.W. Bush out, not because of anything against him. I mean, he had his moments with the first Gulf War, which he was seen as a strong leader, but he also had some economic troubles that, even though they were under control by the time his first term was coming to an end and he was running for re-election, they stuck in the minds of American voters, and he was a one-term president. I'm focusing on Reagan and Clinton for the simple reason that they are typically seen as very successful presidents. But Reagan was not able to get done a lot of the policy initiatives he wanted to get done because of opposition from Congress. He was also weakened by things like the Iran-Contra scandal that you may have learned about in U.S. history last year. Clinton, again, also seen as a successful president, but after 1994, he had to deal with a Republican-controlled Congress, and so a lot of Clinton's successes are seen as the result of successful negotiation between his presidency and Congress. But, right, as we approach our own time, and we're in the 21st century for all of this, there is the notion that we are having a return of the imperial presidency. In fact, Charlie Savage, it's a journalistic account, but it was a very popular and well-received argument about the return of the imperial presidency. And this, as you can kind of see, it's mostly hidden. That's during the George W. Bush administration, which began in January of 2001. And for George W. Bush, one of the key elements in the argument of the return of the imperial presidency is the Bush administration's championing of something called unitary executive theory. This did not originate in the George W. Bush administration, but kind of took on a new role. And this is a legal theory that the President of the United States, as the leader of the executive branch, should have absolute control of the executive branch and what it does without interference from the other branches. And that may not sound like a bold claim, but what that allows for is a lot of presidential autonomy, a lot of ability to do things within the executive branch without input from Congress. And so this was a big deal at the time. In the Obama administration, executive privilege was something that was seen as a big issue. Again, executive privilege is not new, but it was used by the Obama administration in some kind of provocative and controversial ways. One of those had to do with the Fast and Furious scandal, in which the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, now known as the BATFE, used to just be called the ATF, essentially allowed illegal firearms to be purchased in the legal firearms to be purchased in illegal ways in the United States and then smuggled into Mexico, where they were used in some prominent murders. And when kind of news of this got out, there were congressional investigations, and the Obama administration resisted providing information about what had been done and what was known under the claimed power of executive privilege. President Obama was also, his administration was associated with a pretty assertive use of recess appointments. Recess appointments are something that presidents can do. The idea is that if there is a vacancy in a judicial branch role that the executive appoints, or an executive branch office that is appointed by the president, but both of those would require Senate confirmation, the president can appoint people to those roles temporarily. It kind of works out to be roughly a year. But the president can only do that when the Senate is in recess. Okay, so when the Senate is not meeting and is not really able to quickly convene for a meeting to confirm those appointments. What President Obama tried to do was say that even when Congress was on kind of short breaks, but where members of the Senate were meeting, I think it was roughly every 3 days, he said, look, Congress is still in recess and I can make these appointments. And that's kind of what's captured in this political cartoon. That was ruled against by the Supreme Court in National Labor Relations Board versus Noel Canning, in which the Supreme Court said the situations in which President Obama was claiming to be making recess appointments really did not fit the definition of the Senate being in recess. Okay, so there is pushback. And then, of course, something we talked about quite a while ago would be extrajudicial killings, especially the al-Awlaki case, where the Obama administration ordered the assassination of an American-born, he was born in New Mexico, I believe, but he was associated with al-Qaeda. He was in Yemen, where the United States argued he was acting as the leader of al-Qaeda within the Arabian Peninsula, and the drone strike was ordered to kill him, and did in fact kill him. And the Obama administration claimed that they could kill an American citizen without due process, which is something that's guaranteed in the Fifth Amendment. And what the Obama administration said was, well, due process doesn't necessarily mean judicial due process. We deliberated about the decision to kill him in the executive branch, and that itself constituted due process, which was a pretty extensive claim. And the result of that is still unsettled. I mean, we don't have a Supreme Court case to give us clear guidance on whether presidents can or cannot do that. And then, of course, with the Trump administration, and now as we're in the second, we've already seen in the second Trump administration especially, not that we didn't see it in the first, extensive use of executive orders. DOJ, this is something we could have talked about with George W. Bush. He also appointed people that he referred to as czars. They were informal positions within the executive branch. They weren't cabinet-level positions. They weren't in parts of the executive office of the president that had been created by Congress. But of course, with DOJ, that is certainly the clearest and most high-profile example we have, where a president has appointed someone to run an office created by the president. And the question is, Elon Musk seems to have a lot of authority. DOJ is taking very significant actions, and Elon Musk has not been confirmed in the Senate to have such an important role. So the question is, does he need to? So that is an open question, and hence the question mark for that bullet point. The same thing with adjourning Congress. This is something that we haven't seen this quite come to a head yet, but President Trump did say or suggest that if there is resistance to some of his appointments, he will use constitutional power to adjourn Congress, and while Congress is adjourned, he will make appointments. Presidents can adjourn Congress, but only under very narrow circumstances. If, for example, the House and the Senate could not agree on a time to adjourn. In that case, the president could step into that conflict and adjourn Congress because the houses would be deadlocked. But that's what's in the Constitution. The suggestion here is that President Trump might adjourn Congress outside of that situation in order to make recess appointments. Yeah, but again, open question. We haven't seen it happen yet. We don't know how that would shake out. And then the other open question is the defiance of judicial orders. With the deportation of Venezuelan immigrants to prison in El Salvador, the detentions of people in the United States with student visas who have had their visas revoked by the executive branch, and then those people have been detained and then moved outside of the place where they were originally detained. Judges have ordered against both of those actions, and the question is, did the Trump administration's actions defy those court orders, or was it simply a matter of the Trump administration had already acted before those judges had issued orders that would have prevented that action? That, of course, also we have to wait to see shake out. But all of these things, and don't read too much. We could have also included Biden in here as well. He certainly used executive orders and took major executive actions, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So don't take partisanship into this. But the question is, are we returning to an imperial presidency? There's arguments on both sides, but for now, there are pretty significant steps taken by executives, presidents across, bridging the parties that, suggest that we are in a period of ascendancy for presidential power. And that is where we will leave it.